Hello. In this section, I would like to talk about the tactics used by terrorists. And again, as in the previous sections in this module, I've been talking about trying to contrast the stereotypes we have about terrorism to what we see when we look very broadly at the global terrorism database and the approximately 113,000 cases we have in that database going back to 1970. In essence, what I'd like to do is talk about terrorism in the same way that we talk about other types of crime like homicide and robbery. Just like we've come up with descriptions of how those events happen, in these three lectures I've been wanting to try to provide some similar kinds of detail about how on the ground terrorist attacks actually happen. Now, in terms of tactics, I suspect a common stereotype is that there seems to be an almost limitless range of things that terrorists can do when we look at some of the horrendous events that have happened over the past 40 or 50 years. But when we actually look at real cases, the options, I think, are not as vast as you might think. In fact, when we examine a large number of attacks over a long period of time, we can see that the tactical options available to terrorists are, in fact, relatively limited. In the first figure, we show the main tactics used in the 113,000 attacks in the GTD. We begin with a brief definition of each type of tactic because these may not be commonsensical. And then we'll look, as we've done in other modules, I want to talk about how tactics vary over different parts of the world and also how they have changed over time. Let's start with bombings. Presumably, the main objective of a bombing is to use explosives to destroy or damage facilities, to kill individuals, or both. Unless you're talking about suicide bombers delivering an explosive device, it's most often the case that bombs are secretly placed at a time when the target area is unpopulated, and then they're detonated after the bomber has departed, as I say, with the main exception being suicide bombers. The use of explosives distinguishes bombings from armed assaults, of course, as does the fact that for bombings there's no intention to take over or occupy a building or an installation. Oftentimes with armed attacks, the purpose is to actually take over a facility or to take over an institution or perhaps to take a hostage. Many bombings recorded in the GTD explicitly targeted unoccupied structures. In fact, in many organizations active during the 1970s and 1980s, this would include the IRA, the ETA, even the Red Army faction, there was often an effort to warn individuals to get out of buildings before a bomb was about to explode. This, of course, has become much less common in recent years, but was fairly common in the 1970s and 1980s. Another very common tactic, of course, is the armed assault. And armed assaults are simply attacks for which the perpetrators are present and actively engaged during the attack. Presumably, the main objective of an armed assault is to cause physical harm or to cause death to humans through either the use of firearms, explosives, or even less than lethal weapons. The March 2012 shooting of Jewish children and a French-Israeli rabbi outside of a Jewish school in Toulouse by French-Algerian Islamist Mohammed Merah is classified as an armed assault in the GTD. Before Merah was killed in a standoff with French commandos on March 22nd, he killed 7 people and injured many others in 3 separate attacks carried out with a semi-automatic pistol while riding his motorcycle. As the name implies, an unarmed assault does not involve explosives, firearms, incendiary devices, or sharp objects. In most of the unarmed assaults in the GTD, perpetrators were seeking to cause physical harm or death without coming into contact with their victims. So in other words, these attacks often involve weapons like chemical weapons, biological weapons, could be food poison or anthrax. They often result actually in a lot more injuries than deaths. Assassinations differ from armed assaults, from unarmed assaults, and from bombings in that they target specific individuals that have some special status or prominence. Could be a high-ranking police officer, could be a government official, could be a business person or a religious leader. In some cases, there's a fine distinction, of course, between an assassination and an armed assault or a bombing. And oftentimes, how these get coded in the GTD depends on the prominence of the target and trying to infer the intentions of the perpetrators. And obviously, we do a better job of this when we have more detailed information on what the motives of the perpetrators were. For example, an attack that involves explosives and targets a building will generally be classified as a bombing in the GTD. unless there's some indication that the perpetrator's intent was to kill a particular individual or individuals in the building because of their rank or status. Generally, attacks against vehicles carrying police, police posts, or on other places where police congregate are classified as armed assaults, or sometimes as explosions, depending on the weapons used. By contrast, if the main objective of the attack is to bring about the death of a specific identified person or persons well recognized by the media or the government, the GTD generally classifies these cases as assassinations. Now, there are three types of tactics that involve taking hostages, and they're all a little bit different. All three have, though, as their primary objective to obtain political or other concessions in exchange for the release of these hostages. The perpetrators may also demand monetary ransom. However, hostage takings that are carried out purely for monetary ransom are typically excluded from the GTD. There has to be a political motive included as well. So let's talk very briefly about these three types of hostage situations. The first we call a barricade attack. This is a situation where the hostages remain at the site of the attack. They're not free to leave. And hostage barricade attacks are typically short-lived. They typically play out pretty rapidly. A second type of attack involving hostages, which does not typically play out rapidly, is a kidnapping. Perpetrators in this case target specific victims, but they move them or attempt to move them to a clandestine location. To the extent that kidnappers can keep their whereabouts and location of their victims unknown, these types of attacks can go on for a very long period of time, sometimes, in fact, into the years. Finally, hijackings are kidnappings by means of taking control of a vehicle, usually an aircraft, but it could be a boat or bus, and diverting it to a different location. The key distinction in terms of our treatment of tactics between hijackings and other forms of hostage taking is that for the former, the target is a vehicle and not the specific passengers who happen to be in the vehicle. We also have a large category called facility or infrastructure attacks. These are attacks that are aimed at a non-human target. They could be aimed at a building, at a monument, at a train, at a pipeline, at a chemical factory. And if they do not involve explosives, we would count them as facility or infrastructure attacks. Attacks involving incendiary devices such as Molotov cocktails or firebombs are typically classified as facility or infrastructure attacks. This type of attack is generally less likely to produce fatalities than other types because it targets the infrastructure rather than the individuals or groups who happen to be occupying it. Facility attacks are primarily aimed at damaging property or reducing the functioning of an operating system without causing direct injury to victims. However, facility attacks obviously can injure people and frequently do. For example, there are several facility infrastructure attacks in the GTT in which perpetrators sabotage trains, causing the trains to derail and resulting in serious injury and many deaths to passengers. Of course, terrorists can also use more than one tactic in terms of achieving their goals. Bombings can be followed by armed assaults. A combination of tactics is sometimes used by the Taliban. And as we learned on 9/11, arson and explosions can be achieved with hijacked airplanes as well. In fact, the 9/11 attacks are a good example of how complex it can be to capture multiple tactics, because these events included elements consistent with hijackings, of course. It included armed assault, but also bombings and also facility or infrastructure attacks, all within one incident. Perhaps the most striking feature of the figure that you have seen is that close to half of all terrorist attacks between 1970 and 2012 were bombings. And this obviously goes back to an earlier lecture where we talked about how important explosions were in terms of weapons. And so this also fits into tactics, of course. A good example of a bombing is the February 2004 attack on Super Ferry 14, when a member of the group Abu Sayyaf targeted a passenger vessel in Manila Bay in the Philippines. The attacker carried a large box containing a television packed with nearly 4 kilograms of the explosive TNT, left it on his seat deep in the ship before he departed. An hour after the ship began, the box exploded, seriously damaging the ship and killing more than 100 passengers. Another less well-publicized bombing occurred at the Talafar market in northern Iraq in March 2007. Particularly heinous one, in fact. A truck loaded with a mixture of flour and TNT explosives was rushed through Army checkpoints because the city desperately needed the flour. As people were drawn to the truck for the flour, it exploded, killing more than 150 people, wounding more than 300 others, destroying more than 100 homes, and leaving a 23-meter crater in the ground. In addition to the bombings, the figure also shows that more than 1/4 of the attacks in the GTD between 1970 and 2012 were armed assaults. Again, harking back to the earlier lecture on weapons, this makes sense because we saw earlier that firearms are a very important weapon used by terrorists. Compared to those who use explosives, perpetrators of armed assaults are more likely to have direct contact with their targets because of the nature of the tactic. Several of the synchronized attacks that took place in Mumbai in 2008 involved armed assaults using firearms and explosives. 5 teams of 2 attackers each coordinated numerous attacks over 4 days using AK-47 rifles combined with hand grenades, killing more than 175 individuals and injuring several hundred others. The next most common tactics shown in the last figure are assassinations, followed by facility attacks. If we take them together, bombings, armed assaults, assassinations, and facility attacks account for 93% of all attacks in the GTD between 1970 and 2012, so by far the great majority. What I want to do to wind this section up is again talk about tactics and how they vary across regions of the world, and then finally talk a little bit about how they've changed over time. If we look at the next slide, it shows the frequency of the most common terrorist attacks in the GTD over the different regions of the world. We see that while the majority of attacks are consistently bombings and armed assaults, there is considerable variation in these tactical preferences across the regions of the world. For example, the prevalence of bombings by region ranges from a low of 36% in Central America and the Caribbean to a high of 57% in the Middle East and North Africa. Likewise, the share of armed assaults by region ranges from a low of only 11% in Western Europe to a high of 46% in Central America. In fact, Central America is the only region where armed assaults are substantially more common than bombings. This may be in large part because Central America was home to 2 long-lasting conflicts that were marked by their uncommon reliance on guerrilla tactics. This included the Contras of Nicaragua and the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or the FMLN, in El Salvador. In general, assassinations were more common than facility attacks. As a percentage of attacks involving these 4 tactics, assassinations were most common in Central Asia, with 31% of all attacks, and least common in North America, with only 8% of all attacks. While facility attacks in general were the least common of these 4 attacks, regional exceptions to this pattern are found, particularly North America, East Asia, Western Europe, and Australasia, Oceania. In fact, for North America and East Asia, facility attacks are second only to bombings as a tactic, suggesting that compared to perpetrators in other regions, terrorists in these regions were less interested in killing or injuring people. Finally, let me close this session by talking a little bit how these tactics have changed over time. In the next figure, we show how frequently the 4 most important tactics have been over the years between 1970 and 2012. In general, the tactics hold the same order of prevalence over time. So in other words, the most important are bombings, followed by armed assaults, followed by assassinations, and then by facility attacks. In fact, bombings remain the most common tactic for all the years in the series except 1972 and 1973, when they were briefly eclipsed by assassinations. During most of the 1970s, there were more assassinations than armed assaults, suggesting that in this period, terrorists focused more specifically on targeting prominent individuals rather than striking out more generally at random targets. As the total number of attacks grew throughout the 1980s, the number of armed assaults became much more common, and it eventually replaced assassinations. And this pattern has continued through to the end of the series in 2012. The only other major exception to these general patterns is that facility attacks and assassinations continued to alternate in frequency for the last decade of the series. In some years there are more assassinations, and in other years there are more facility attacks. What can we conclude about tactics of terrorism? I began this section by talking about some of our stereotypes about tactics, and I think one of these stereotypes is that terrorists have a very large realm of possibilities when it comes to tactics. But actually, when we look at the range of tactics used in these 113,000 cases, it reminds us a little bit about the range available for weapons and targets as well. In other words, it's much more limited. Our analysis over 40-some years shows that tactical strategies are relatively limited. They're also relatively unsophisticated, a theme that we've talked about earlier when we talked about weapons. A majority of attacks, a strong majority of attacks, rely on bombings or armed assaults. Yet still, they have the capacity, as we talked about in earlier lectures, to be highly lethal. Terrorists using explosives risk accidents and death through the transportation of these explosives, through assembly of these explosives, and through actually executing the attacks. And those relying on armed attacks face elevated risk because such tactics require direct contact with the targets. In short, most of the tactics used are relatively low level in terms of sophistication. Most pose serious risks of injury and death to the attackers, and most involve relatively straightforward sorts of tactical options. Thank you very much for your attention.